Welcome to Presidential Fight Club, the show that answers the question, if all 44 presidents fought each other one-on-one, who would win? Hosted by two history professors who have too much time on their hands, Scott Rank and James Early. Welcome to the second fight in the third round of the Northeastern Regional of the Presidential Fight Club. That's hard to keep up. Well, that's kind of like what an NCAA tournament bracket is, and we're really getting into things.
Yeah, follow your brackets.
Yeah, we'll link out to all these different things, so keep track of it and fill them in, and hopefully this is so popular that there's being office pools for the different presidential fights.
Yeah.
This fight is JFK, who previously trounced Chester A. Arthur, versus Franklin Roosevelt, who trounced Donald Trump. James, tell us about JFK.
All right, so here we have the Battle of the Rich Boys. Both of them obviously born into fabulous wealth. And some people would argue, well, he was a rich boy and he was pampered, so he wouldn't be much of a fighter. But that is not the case. Certainly not with Theodore Roosevelt, and certainly not with Franklin Roosevelt, and definitely not with John F. Kennedy. We talked about earlier in a previous fight how Kennedy was had some similarities to Theodore Roosevelt in that he had a lot of ailments and physical issues. He dealt with back pain. He dealt with digestive issues. He dealt with headaches. He had all kinds of problems. He took many, many medicines and was on the verge of death many times in his life. But Kennedy always rallied back. It's like he refused to die. He just wasn't ready to die just yet. And so Kennedy, like Theodore Roosevelt, undertook a very strenuous regimen of physical exercise, lifting weights, running, and just doing calisthenics and doing all kinds of things to get himself into shape, to get himself to where he wasn't so sickly and so frail. He was super duper thin. He was 6 feet tall, but he probably, I don't know what he weighed, but when I've seen photos of him as a young man, and he probably wasn't much more than about 140, 150, very, very thin. But Kennedy does bring a fighting spirit. As we said, a couple times now, he wasn't going to let anything get him down, not even serious physical illness. He campaigned when he was campaigning for Congress and then senator and then later president. He would often be wearing a back brace. He would just be dealing with excruciating pain and popping pills as best he could to deal with it. But he persevered. And he stood up. He stood up to all of his opponents. He stood up to the Soviets later on. And I don't know that he actually engaged in a lot of boxing or wrestling or any kind of physical combat. He probably did some when he was in college, but he was a war hero, very heroic. We talked about how he towed a crew member to safety, a crew member who was on the verge of drowning. He towed him away, holding a rope in his teeth. So that's saying something. So Kennedy was the kind of person who was going to give you everything he had, and he was going to either win or he was going to die trying.
Roosevelt has a really similar background. He has a lot of health problems as well. When he was a child, he had headaches, influenza, pneumonia, chronic sinus problems. I don't know what it is about all these plutocratic presidents from the early 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. They're like the Habsburg dynasty, where I don't know if it's this inbreeding among the really wealthy that makes these really sickly children or whatever. But Franklin had
I know, right? It's like 3 out of these 4 in this semifinal in round 3 had such a similar story with horrible physical ailments that they overcame through just sheer determination and exercise.
Yeah, I guess at that period that infant death would take a lot of people who were less wealthy, but if you were more wealthy, you would be able to survive longer due to good nutrition, but you don't have modern medicine or vaccines to make sure you don't get polio or measles or whatnot. Maybe, I don't know, that could be a factor. So Roosevelt has physical problems. Before he gets polio, when he's in his late 30s, he does work to overcome them. He is an outdoorsman. He likes sailing, fishing, going on hikes. And the other factor, and we've come back to this a lot, but I think it's very pertinent to Roosevelt, is mental toughness. He said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So if you're fear, then he'll be afraid of you. But if you're not, then he won't be. Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, probably the most manipulative, intimidating presidents. He had intimidation down to a science. Said FDR was the only person I ever knew anywhere who is not afraid. And one last thing about FDR, I think it's easy to say, well, he was sort of a pampered rich boy. He was this blue blood, so he wouldn't be able to get rough and tumble like some other presidents like Andrew Jackson who grow up on the frontier. And that can be true, but the idea of being wealthy and being a blue blood in the early 20th century was a little different. There's a book that I read called The Millionaires' Unit, The Aristocratic Flyboys Who Fought the Great War and Invented American Air Power. So it's about these fighters in World War I. But a point the book makes is that for these young men who were part of the Gilded Age and had all the wealth and power that you had at this time, there was an understanding that there was an obligation to the nation, that you had to sacrifice something as an elite. And all that you have received, you owe it to the nation to engage in these acts of heroism and put yourself in real legitimate danger. So in some branches of the military, like the Navy, there was a strong aristocratic tradition, and that's not as much the case now, but this was the generation that Roosevelt came from. So he had a sense of duty and honor and would sacrifice himself for the right cause, and I think this fight is the right cause. So James, who is the winner?
Well, this one was fairly close, but in the end, the voters of American History Fanatics selected John F. Kennedy as the winner. I would say that Kennedy got the edge, even though the two men were similar physically. Kennedy had that combat experience. And he had done all the strenuous exercise when he was a young man, and I think that just gave him a little bit of a combative edge, if you will. He would be much better in hand-to-hand combat than even the young, healthy, or fairly healthy Franklin Roosevelt.
Right. There's that combat experience that he does have. He's definitely not lacking in mental tenacity, so it's sort of a meeting of the minds between him and FDR. The drive to win at all costs, no matter what it takes. And in one sense, some people think that his sickliness gave him sort of a freedom where he would live life to the fullest and wouldn't fear death in some senses. So the way that a person could hold back in a fight wouldn't have been on Kennedy the same way. I can see that happening.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, this wraps up our quarterfinals. We have two presidents advancing. No. This is the semifinals. We have two presidents advancing to the final fight of the Northeastern Regional. And that is Teddy Roosevelt versus JFK. Thanks for listening to Presidential Fight Club. If you'd like to download your own printable bracket sheets for each regional tournament so you can guess how the tournament will go, check out presidentialfightclub.com. We'd appreciate it if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts as well. Thanks for listening, and may you fight with the stamina of Teddy Roosevelt, the courage of George Washington, and the reach of Abraham Lincoln.